Hey, welcome back everyone. Rob here from Ram Studio Comics. So in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about rendering. We're going to try a few different things, but I'm going to start with some shapes that could really be thought of as a bit more abstract. One of the reasons why I like to start this way is it allows you a little bit more freedom and your thought process to draw whatever comes to mind. Maybe zero in a little bit more on just the rendering. But also, when you start to draw stylistically for comics, you realize that there's a lot of shape language that you can introduce into your work to convey things that are supposed to look a certain way. So I think that's part of what helps us to develop our style, is to really be inventive through that process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with a shadow. And what I tend to think about when rendering is, how do I want this to relate as a form as I render it? Because if I just kind of render everywhere, I might get something cool, I might not. But if I think more intently about it, so I don't always do this, but I'm going to show you kind of what I'm thinking. If I have my rendering maybe start to come up to this point and fade off into a pointed line, then I'm going to get a sense of a gradation. And I could go way more abruptly down to, like, say, half of this point. I go past that, and you really need to play around with those variables so that you see what works for you in any given area, and you gotta develop your style that way, right? And I generally flip the page, but I'm just gonna do it this way. It's gonna be a little messier, but that's okay. Sometimes it's good to practice different techniques, but I typically don't pull up. I pull down with these lines, or to the side, usually down. So they're going to be a little bit bumpier. Now I'll always flip the page, but a lot of times I will. So just like that, I've created some tapered lines. Now what I always tell students that are, I've got like these courses on rendering and stuff like that. I'm not trying to promote to you, but I'll leave some links in the description box below. So I guess I am promoting to you. My bad. But I'll tell them, like, you need to really play around with the way that this converges together. So notice the more you bring this together, you get a kind of a negative shape of a, V-like pattern or something like that. To me, what this means when you do that is that you get more of a gradation, or more of a segue from the dark to light. Where a lot of times what I see, and let me finish this one, I'll show you what I see that usually kind of bugs me, and maybe it doesn't bug everybody, but it's something to be aware of. And then play around with different cross-hatching where it fades off the other way. And so in this case, I'm kind of thinking about these being tighter in succession, and or maybe thicker. And then as they fade up this way, you space them out and lighten them up. Okay, so it's just, again, to me, all these are gradations, ways to make something go from dark to light, but in a sense of cross-hatching. And then playing around with different variables of that. Now, if you get too many variables, I think it gets a little messy, but I don't know. There's some styles that do it really well. You just have to see what you can do. Now, usually on the other side, for the most part, it's going to be a solid edge, okay? So you can kind of use that as a rule. So like, I don't know if it is a rule, but say it is. So you bring that down, you leave a solid edge here. It's not that you can't add some, a little bit of texture and fades going off the other way. I think generally it gets a bit confusing, because one of the kind of consistent ideas is that, light's hitting somewhere and you have a darkest point and then you start back up. So it makes more sense. Again, I'm almost thinking like this is like, again, but I'm trying to keep the thought process a bit abstract. Is if there was another shape down here, I would just pick back up and start over again. And so I'm kind of perceiving that light is coming down this way. Okay, there's our light. Let me bring this down. Light bulb up here. Okay, light bulb. You know what I mean. Okay, I'm probably sure I didn't need to draw that for you, but oh well. I did anyways. You are welcome. Okay, so now if we do the same thing here, and then, or I shouldn't say the same thing, a similar thing, but maybe we play around with the fade tapering to shorter lines, right? And then picking back up and going to longer lines, in the vertical direction. Still trying to get some of that taper at the base, right? And maybe we see what that yields as well. So, and it's subtle, right? It's not like I made some big dramatic difference there that you could see more noticeably, but I was thinking about making a little bit of a difference there. Why? Because to me, experimentation leads to you figuring out your style. You have to play around with these different concepts. And sometimes you're like, yeah, it didn't do anything. Well, or sometimes you're like, whoa, that came out cooler than I thought. You just have to play around with it. Wow, look how asymmetrical my little arrow is. That's not good. Okay, so now, yeah, this is, I am starting to think this is a leg, but I was trying not to think about a particular shape. So now let's do the same thing over here, or again, not the same exact thing. Maybe I just use those other ones that are coming up in a tapered way. Now the other way you can do this is you can make just altogether thicker lines like this and thin them out. So I kind of mentioned that with these ones over here, but you can really explore that idea in much more detail. You do very thick lines and slowly taper them out and thin them out. There's all sorts of ways to be creative and inventive with this stuff. So let's go to some different shapes. I'll move this over. Okay, so now with this one, I'm going to bring a shape over to the side like this. You know what I'm going to do? Actually this time I'm just going to say, you know what, this is going to be a thing. Because it's like I almost can't think abstractly at this point. It's kind of messed up, but I probably should just throw like a bunch of squigglies down and then render it. Maybe that would work. But what I'm going to do here is, this to me is the shape that I make for a cheekbone, that little pouch under the lip. And then maybe I render the cheekbone out this way, eye socket here, something like this. Anyways, so for this area of the work, I do try to be inventive with the shapes that I'm using. Even though I'm drawing a certain thing in my mind, I don't want to make it look exactly the way that it might look in real life. I'm trying to mix in shapes that allow me to be a bit more creative as I render through it. Because if I sit there and I go, well, I'm trying to draw a cheekbone exactly the way it looks, and then I'm going to really veer away from any kind of style choices. And actually, I'm just going to make this like they're wearing a suit. So I'll draw a nose. Okay. Something like that. There we go. So ways I could potentially render this is I could say, well, I want there to be a bit of fade going this way. I'm going to blend that back. Okay, I want that fade there. Maybe a crosshatch this way. And then quickly go down to some smaller marks like that. And so this is probably one of those areas where I would shadow the bottom of it. Remember I said over here I probably wouldn't do that. Well, this is an instance where I probably would. So I'd probably just do some lighter lines and quickly fade those off. So what I'm thinking here is that I kind of want a difference from the top to the bottom. And you'll see this in like a lot of anatomy styles. People will render a rounded over form with a dual light source, and they'll specifically make one area quite different than the other. And that's really my goal here, is that I'm trying not to render these exactly the same. I want there to be the separation from a top to bottom. Another thing is, like say this is the eye, where the eye probably goes back further. You tend to notice it whenever you draw an eye from the side like this, it's usually back further than you think. I remember David Finch, he's on my featured channels list, amazing artist, obviously. He said something like that in his video, one of the many great videos he has, and I was like, yep, I totally get that now, because it was for a long time I was putting the eye way too close to here, and this might not be back far enough really, but just keep that in mind. And I'm going to shadow this. Somebody did just ask, and I'll try to address this if they're potentially watching, like how do you do your reverse art or your lines, the negative lines, in the dark. All right, I slaughtered that. But what I'm going to say here is that what I mean by that is these little lines here, if I wanted those in the dark, a solid fill, and I went back, you can use a little bit of white out Okay, so the other way is to draw it first. Like say I'm going to put like a little hint of the nose here, and there's a little bit of a bulk of shadow here. There's a wrinkle here. Let's see, a couple little wrinkles here or something. You're almost better off drawing those with ink. I'm sorry, with white ink, basically. Um, Basically in areas that are full shadow. And the reason being is because if you draw the little lines off in here, you draw these little negatives, and then you start to ink up to it. I remember I used to do that back in the day, and it never seemed to look good. And then it's way harder. But if you just take and draw some of those light little lines in the shadows that you want to see, so it can be as simple as this. But then after you come back and fill this, you just kind of add a little bit of white out. And you can leave a little bit of negative space in there so you can see it better. But I almost find that really you're just better off taking a white ink of some kind and drawing right through it. And you'll almost always get a better look than if you try to draw and ink up to it. Hopefully that makes sense. Maybe I'll explain that in another inking video because I want to bring you guys another one of those real soon. And I would probably carry through the wrinkles all through here. Some need to go past the shape. This isn't really coming out the way I hoped, but with work we would get it. With a little bit of reworking and redrawing. I feel like that nose bump doesn't match this part. We need to go more like this. But you know how it is. You just kind of keep redrawing things to get it right. All right, so now let's add shape here. Do a little bit under the neck here. So here's a good example where you could render something. You could do some cross hatching in here. And I think a good rule of thumb for the cross hatching is 45s. You see in some of them I use a little bit, which would kind of almost be considered more of a 90 or something closer to a 90 against the other line. But 45s give you these nice little diamonds, and you typically can work out from there. So you could throw them in more quickly like that, and then you could just render maybe one or all of the sets, whatever you want to do there. But I think it's helpful to look for these patterns as you're doing that. I also think that it's helpful to draw in these shapes and then see where you can kind of cross over those shapes like this. It's a really quick effect. That's kind of what I should have did a bit, more clearly here, but see how that kind of works? Just that couple little diamond shapes or, angles, another angle this way. And as simple as that is, I can't talk today, it works. You don't have to overthink it. And then you can maybe have another one over here. And then also just playing around with the way that you break up lines. Okay, you vary up these little shapes, thick to thin, little angles, little crossovers. Yeah, and it usually yields results that are pretty cool and fun to color just by thinking that way. So it's kind of crisscrossing, and then highs and lows, obviously. You have to think about, okay, this is the big, beefier part of the neck. That's going to be up higher. So in which case I would, maybe bring that out with some rendering, and I would render that more heavily to showcase that. And even this area right here, I could easily fill that in. But I'll tell you what, I actually like little areas like this where I would fill this, and I would use that other line as a render, as a way to imply cross-hatching. Even here, I kind of like the darker lines and then two lines behind it. I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think it looks cool, so I would leave it. And so that really, to me, when I'm rendering, I'm looking for all those opportunities to just make some happy accidents, old Bob Ross style. You know what I mean? It's just kind of finding your way in the dark is the way I think about it. Like, I don't go in with a very solidified intent or whatever, if that makes any sense. I don't always know exactly what I'm after, and I just kind of make these decisions as I go. I think it's more fun that way. So say there's an ear back here, and we do a couple wrinkles this way. We can have a pocket of shadow first, and then a couple little wrinkles out that way. And then I just keep adding. I might come back over and say, you know what? I want a couple little lines underneath this section of the face, because now I feel like, okay, if all this is so flat, it gets a bit boring. And you see with this big shape I've made, that's a bit too much, right? I'd probably go back and break that up as well. But again, I just keep adding to this and keep making little decisions. And then eventually it would probably expose that this area is too much of a solid shape. Okay, how would I break that up? Well, I got these wrinkles going through here, so I'd probably separate here and there for that, see if that helps. But I feel like I've made too many solid shapes in that one area. Other thing is you can render things like this, so it breaks up the other way. It's like kind of to the side. I use that in a lot of parts of the anatomy just to soften things up. So maybe there's a hard line here, and then I break that up a little bit, soften it up. Don't underestimate the ability to make things look more interesting with your line weight, obviously. Really push that to all sorts of degrees and intensities, because line weight just, I don't know, it makes this stuff bounce off the page. Jump off the page, maybe not bounce off the page. And also you can add some cool shapes. Somebody that comes to mind there is Joe Mad. Like, he'll add these really neat shapes. If I remember correctly, I'm thinking that's what it is. And these little points and these thick areas to the edges, and it just looks so stylized and so cool. Take advantage of that as well. You'll see all sorts of ways you can just kind of render this stuff out. So think of shapes, think of lines. The other thing is that when I am trying to pick apart these areas with different shapes and different lines and different textures, I'm just kind of randomly throwing it in and then blending it together. So even though it may just look like, I don't know, maybe you're watching, it looks like I got a very distinct idea of what I'm doing. As I just mentioned, I don't. But what I hopefully do is that I've gotten good enough at it where I can make it look like I have an idea of what I'm after going into it. Now, I'm not saying I don't have some general concepts in my mind, because I've done it so many times. But there's a lot of just blending it together as I go along the way. So again, think of that it's not so much that you're, drawing things really, really well. Maybe you're really good. You get really good at blending these concepts together with a, rendering style that kind of makes it meld and mush and together. All I could think of is blending it together, like the finish work ties it together. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So basically, if you can look at it like it's layers, and your final layer is your rendering and the way that you pull it all together. But the main thing is really being inventive with the way you put this stuff down, and not thinking like there's just one specific way, a right way, a wrong way, and just, purely developing it based upon style. I think maybe some lines like this. Again, I'm just adding to it, trying to pull it all together. And you can see the cheekbone here is way too solid, maybe rigid of a shape, but I'll be honest, I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave it. And that's, again, to me, that's kind of style, that not everything needs to make sense. Some of the styles that I like the most have areas within the work that make no sense whatsoever, and I think I'm more impressed with that. I think that, to me, that's what drew me to comics. I can do realism. You've probably seen me do it on the channel, or attempt to do it. But I don't do a lot of it because it doesn't really interest me as much. I'm not saying it's not cool. I love watching people that do it well. I follow a lot of people on Instagram and things like that do it very, very well, and I'm super impressed by it. It's just, for me, it doesn't ignite my brain the way that just drawing something even simple like this in a stylistic way does. So to me, that's just, you follow what you what really interests you and what gets you out of bed in the morning, right? You can even put these tiny little points on the edge. There's just so many different ways you could look at the rendering. Just try to be inventive with it. In fact, let me do that. Like, so if you even take these basic lines right here, and you see a kind of a common repetitive thing I'm doing is thick to thin, right? That's obviously the easiest thing to make lines look more interesting, is just vary up the line weight. But it doesn't stop there. Like I just mentioned with that, you could put these tiny little hooks on them. And I'll tell you what, say you work with an inker, I'm betting they would really like you for stuff like this. They're probably going to do this on their own. If you get somebody that's got some really good ink skills, they're going to throw these in, similar ones here and there. But just little things like that, like little points at the end like that. I mean, there's all sorts of neat little intricacies that you can incorporate in there, and it just looks cooler. It's not so plain. Now I'm going to have to redraw this one more time because this just looks bad. It's not even conveying the look and feel that I thought it would, and that's part of the process as well. Like, some of the things aren't going to read as you hoped, and you have to approach it again. So what I want is a feeling that you see some of the volume of the nostril there, but I also want a couple little wrinkles flowing from that point. So maybe what I can do is soften up the way that I was trying to convey that. Let's see if that works. Another thing to think about when you're struggling with an area like this, as I feel like I am, is to just sketch a little bit more lightly. Just kind of throw some things in real soft erase. Kind of let your imagination catch up to what you're trying to do there. And it's like maybe a little bit off this way. Get on there, rub it with your finger. No, I don't know. Maybe smudge it up a bit. I tend to find that if things are a little bit harder to read, then I imagine a little more. But if I throw them down with a really harsh line, then it's almost like I made the decision with that harsh line. So just part of the sketching process. I think I do like that better. And then just keep in mind too, when you want something to have a softer gradation, you're going to probably use longer lines, thinner lines. And then when you want something to be more abrupt and it's almost like you're giving it more steep round over, you can use these tighter little points. But all sorts of variations from that, and also spacing it out. Yeah, I think I like that a little better. I would just keep going and going. So yeah, I don't want this to be too awful long. I know somehow we're already at 23 minutes and I've just drawn these two little illustrations for you. Imagine that. And hey everybody, if you want to learn more, I've got a full course on rendering. I'll make sure to link that in the description box below so you can check it out. I really appreciate you tuning in to today's video. I'd love to know what you think, as well as what you'd like to see in the future. As always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and bye for now.